I once believed Adrian Kane feared nothing in this world, but the night I walked into his Christmas party with a small envelope in my hand, I learned even the most powerful man can freeze when the past finds him. Snow was falling outside the tall windows of the Kane estate, slow and quiet like the city had decided to hold its breath, and inside the mansion the lights were warm gold, reflecting off crystal glasses and polished marble floors while men in expensive suits spoke in careful voices that never rose too loud whenever Adrian Kane was nearby. Everyone in Chicago knew his name, even if they pretended they didn't. He was the kind of man people described in lowered voices, the kind of man whose presence alone could quiet an entire room without him saying a word. I wasn't supposed to be there. My name is Emily Carter, and I was just a part-time assistant helping deliver holiday gifts for a small charity downtown, the kind that sends cookies and thank you cards to people who donate money during the winter. Someone had told my supervisor that Mr. Kane gave a generous donation every December, and somehow the job of bringing the envelope ended up in my hands. I remember standing outside the massive iron gates earlier that evening with snow dusting my coat, wondering if I had the wrong address, because the place looked less like a house and more like something from a movie about powerful men and quiet secrets. 2 guards watched me the entire time I walked up the long driveway, their expressions calm but alert, like they were measuring every step I took. By the time the doors opened and I stepped inside, the warmth of the mansion wrapped around me along with the low sound of piano music drifting through the hallway. The party was already in full swing, yet the moment Adrian Kane entered the main room, everything shifted slightly, like gravity itself had leaned in his direction. He was taller than I expected, dressed in a dark suit that looked perfectly tailored, his expression calm in a way that made everyone else seem nervous without knowing why. People greeted him carefully, respectfully, but no one interrupted him, and no one touched him unless he offered his hand first. I should have handed the envelope to one of the staff and left. But something made me walk forward instead. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the strange feeling that the photograph inside the envelope had been waiting longer than I realized to reach him. When I finally stood in front of Adrian Kane, the music still playing softly behind us, I held out the envelope and said the only thing that came to mind. This was supposed to reach you tonight. He looked at me for a second, just long enough for the room to feel smaller. Then he took the envelope between his fingers with casual patience. I expected a polite nod, maybe a quiet thank you before someone escorted me out. Instead, the moment he slid the photograph halfway into the light, Adrian Kane stopped breathing. His hand didn't drop. It trembled, and in a voice so quiet I almost thought I imagined it. The most powerful man in the room whispered a question that made every conversation around us disappear. How did you find this? For a few seconds I could not answer him because nothing about his reaction made sense to me. Adrian Kane was still staring at the photograph like it had just spoken his name. Around us the party slowly came back to life, but the voices were quieter now, careful, curious. A man standing near the fireplace stopped mid-sentence and watched. One of the guards near the staircase shifted his weight slightly, as if waiting for a signal that never came. I swallowed and tried to understand what was happening. To me it was just an old picture. The edges were worn and the colors had faded the way photographs do when they have been sitting inside a drawer for too many years. In the image a small girl stood beside a fire truck with snow on the ground behind her. A firefighter was kneeling next to her with one hand on her shoulder. The truck number was visible. Engine 14. My father's station. I had seen that photograph 100 times growing up. It used to sit inside a metal locker in the corner of our garage along with his old helmet and the heavy coat that still smelled faintly like smoke and winter air. I never thought it meant anything beyond a memory from his job. When my father passed away 3 months ago, I was the one who cleaned out the garage. That was when I found the envelope tucked inside the helmet lining with a single note written in careful handwriting. If anything ever happens to me, make sure this reaches Adrian Kane. At first I thought it was a mistake. The name felt too big, too distant from our quiet life on the south side of Chicago. But the more I stared at the photograph, the more I felt like my father had left it there for a reason he never had time to explain. Now Adrian Kane was looking at me with an intensity that made the entire room feel colder despite the warm lights and the music still drifting softly through the house. His fingers tightened slightly around the photograph, but he held it carefully, almost gently, as if the paper itself mattered more than anything else in the room. I finally found my voice. I told him the truth because it was the only thing I had. My father was a firefighter. His name was Daniel Carter. After he passed away, I found the photograph in his locker along with your name. I thought maybe it was important to you. Adrian Kane did not respond right away. Instead, he looked back down at the photograph, and something changed in his expression, something quiet and distant like he was standing in another year entirely. Then he asked another question, softer this time, the kind of question a person asks when they are afraid of hearing the answer but cannot stop themselves. Your father, did he ever tell you about a fire on the north side 15 winters ago? Because the girl standing next to that fire truck was supposed to be gone forever, and yet the photograph in his hand proved that night had never really disappeared. I tried to remember every conversation I had ever had with my father about fires, rescues, or the long winter nights when he came home smelling like cold air and smoke, but nothing in my memory sounded like what Adrian Kane was describing. 15 winters ago, I was still a kid who believed firefighters were quiet heroes who simply showed up when alarms rang and left when the danger was gone. My father never talked much about the difficult calls. He always said the job was about helping people and then going home for dinner. So when Adrian Kane asked me about a fire on the north side all those years ago, the only honest answer I could give was a slow shake of my head. I told him that my father never shared details like that with me. The most he ever said was that winter fires were the hardest because the cold made everything slower and heavier. Adrian listened carefully, his eyes still resting on the photograph like he was searching inside it for something only he could see. Around us the party had started to move again, but in a strange way the space around us remained quiet, like an invisible circle had formed where no one dared interrupt. I watched as he traced the edge of the photograph with his thumb, stopping when his finger reached the small girl standing beside the fire truck. She could not have been older than 6 or 7 years old. Her hair was light, and her winter coat looked too large for her small shoulders. Snow covered the street behind her, and the firefighter kneeling beside her had one hand resting gently on her shoulder, as if making sure she felt safe. That firefighter was my father. I had recognized him immediately when I first found the picture in his locker months ago. Adrian Kane finally looked up at me again, but the expression on his face had changed. The calm confidence that filled the room earlier had softened into something quieter, almost careful. He asked me another question, one that sounded less like a command and more like a memory he was trying to confirm. Did your father ever mention a little girl he helped that night? Maybe someone who did not have family with her when the fire department arrived. I thought about that for a moment, searching through old conversations at the kitchen table and long drives home from school. Then a small memory surfaced. Once when I was about 10 years old, I had asked him why he kept an old photograph in his locker instead of at home. He smiled and told me some pictures were reminders that the world still had second chances. At the time, I did not understand what he meant. Standing in the middle of Adrian Kane's mansion with snow still falling beyond the windows, I repeated those exact words to him. The moment I did, the color slowly drained from his face. He looked back down at the photograph and whispered something so quiet I almost missed it. That was what she used to say. My sister believed that too. Then Adrian Kane lifted his eyes toward me again, and for the first time that night, the most powerful man in the room looked less like a boss and more like someone who had just realized a story he buried years ago was about to be told. Adrian Kane did not speak for several seconds after I repeated my father's words. And in that silence, I realized something strange had happened to the most controlled man in the room. His shoulders were still perfectly straight, his expression calm enough that no one watching from a distance would notice anything unusual, yet his eyes had drifted somewhere far beyond the golden lights of the mansion and the quiet music echoing through the halls. It was the look of someone standing inside an old memory. He slowly turned the photograph so the light from the chandelier fell across the image more clearly. I could see the reflection in his eyes as he studied the small girl standing beside the fire truck. Snow rested on the ground around her boots, and her smile was bright in the cold winter air. She looked safe. She looked like a child who had just been told everything was going to be all right. Adrian spoke again, but this time his voice carried a different weight, softer and more careful than before. He asked me how old I was 15 years ago. The question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. I told him I was 8 years old that winter. He nodded slowly as if doing the math in his mind. 8 years old meant I would have been close to my father when that photograph was taken, close enough to hear stories he might have brought home after long nights at the station. Adrian then asked if my father ever mentioned a little girl named Isabella. The name hung in the air between us. I searched my memory again, digging through the quiet corners of childhood conversations and old evenings at our kitchen table. I could not remember that name. I shook my head and told him the truth. My father never spoke about someone named Isabella. Adrian lowered his gaze back to the photograph. When he spoke again, the words came slowly, like he was opening a door that had been closed for many years. He told me Isabella was his younger sister. 15 winters ago, there was a fire on the north side of Chicago in a narrow row of old brick buildings where their family had once lived. That night, everything changed for him. When the fire department arrived, the building had already filled with smoke and confusion. Neighbors gathered outside in heavy coats, while firefighters worked quickly in the freezing air. Adrian was 19 years old at the time and standing across the street watching the lights flash against the snow when a firefighter carried his sister outside wrapped in a blanket. That firefighter was Daniel Carter, my father. Adrian paused there and looked at me again as if measuring how much I could understand from the story so far. He said my father knelt beside Isabella in the snow and promised her something simple. He told her that sometimes the world gives people a second chance, and that she should remember that feeling for the rest of her life. Adrian's voice grew quieter when he repeated those words. Then he turned the photograph toward me again so I could see the moment frozen in time. That was the moment my father captured with a camera someone had handed him that night. A small girl smiling beside a fire truck while the winter sky glowed with red lights behind her. Adrian's fingers tightened slightly around the photograph as he finished the thought he had been holding back since I first arrived. The reason his hands shook earlier was not fear. It was disbelief. Because according to every report filed after that fire, Isabella Kane had disappeared before the night was over and no one had ever seen her again. The words settled between us like falling snow, quiet but impossible to ignore. I stared at Adrian Kane, trying to understand what he had just told me. A missing girl. A winter fire. A photograph taken by my father at the exact moment everything should have ended differently. None of it sounded like the simple story I believed my father had lived. For years I thought I knew every chapter of his life. He was a firefighter who woke up early, drank strong coffee, and fixed things around our small house on Sundays. Yet standing inside the most powerful mansion in Chicago, I was beginning to realize there were pieces of his story he had never shared with me. Adrian still held the photograph carefully between his fingers. The music in the room had changed to a slow holiday song, but neither of us noticed the melody anymore. His attention remained fixed on that frozen moment beside the fire truck. I finally asked the question that had been growing in my mind since he finished speaking. If Isabella was rescued that night, how could she simply disappear afterward? Adrian did not answer right away. He looked past me toward the tall windows where the snow continued drifting down over the dark Chicago skyline. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of someone remembering a night that never truly ended. He said that after the firefighters brought Isabella outside, everything seemed calm for a short time. She was warm inside a blanket and sitting near the ambulance while the crews finished their work. My father stayed with her for several minutes, making sure she felt safe. Adrian remembered that clearly because he had been standing only a few feet away. But sometime later, when the fire trucks began packing up and the crowd started thinning out, Isabella was suddenly gone. No one saw her leave. No one saw where she went. At first, everyone assumed a relative or neighbor had taken her home. But when Adrian began searching the neighborhood later that night, no one had any answers. Days passed, and the police looked through every report from that evening. The official explanation was confusion during the evacuation. A child lost in the chaos of a cold winter night. Adrian told me he never believed that explanation. He spent years asking questions that led nowhere. Eventually, the city moved on. The reports were filed away, and Isabella Kane became another name that quietly disappeared from public memory. Adrian lowered his gaze again to the photograph in his hand. His voice softened when he spoke the next words. He said that was why the picture meant so much. It was the last moment anyone could prove she was safe. The last moment she was seen standing in the snow beside Engine 14 with a firefighter's hand resting on her shoulder. My father's hand. I felt a strange chill even, though the room was warm. The photograph suddenly seemed heavier than a simple piece of paper. It was not just a memory. It was the only proof that Isabella Kane existed beyond the official reports. I told Adrian something else then, something I had not mentioned earlier. When I found the photograph inside my father's helmet lining, there was also a second note folded behind it. I had almost forgotten about it because the message was so short. Adrian's eyes lifted slowly to meet mine. The room around us had grown quiet again, without either of us noticing. I took a steady breath and repeated the exact words written in my father's careful handwriting. If you ever meet the man named Adrian Kane, tell him the truth about the girl who smiled in the snow, because she was never truly lost. I felt the air in the room change the moment those words left my mouth. Adrian Kane did not move right away, but the silence that followed was heavier than anything he had said all evening. His eyes stayed locked on mine, as if he was trying to decide whether the sentence I had just repeated was real or something his mind had imagined after too many years of unanswered questions. Around us, the quiet conversations at the Christmas party continued in careful tones, but the space between us felt completely separate from the rest of the mansion. Adrian slowly lowered his hand, the photograph still held between his fingers, and I could see the faint reflection of the chandelier light across the old paper. For a long moment, he said nothing at all. Then he asked me to repeat the note again, word for word. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of urgency underneath it, like a man listening for the last missing piece of a story he had been chasing for half his life. I repeated it exactly the way I remembered reading it in my father's handwriting. If you ever meet the man named Adrian Kane, tell him the truth about the girl who smiled in the snow, because she was never truly lost. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, as if those words carried him somewhere far away. When he opened them again, the controlled expression he always wore had shifted into something quieter and more thoughtful. He asked me if the note said anything else. I shook my head and told him that was the entire message. No explanation, no date, nothing more than that single instruction folded behind the photograph inside the lining of his old firefighter helmet. Adrian looked down again at the picture, but this time the confusion in his eyes had slowly turned into something else. Determination. I could almost see the moment a new possibility formed in his mind. For 15 years the world had believed Isabella Kane disappeared that winter night. Every report, every official document, every conversation in the city had ended with the same conclusion. A missing child lost in the confusion of a cold Chicago fire. But my father had written something different. He had written that she was never truly lost. Adrian finally spoke again, and this time his voice was steadier than before. He told me my father was not the kind of man who left cryptic messages for no reason. A firefighter who spent his life protecting people understood the weight of truth. If Daniel Carter had written that sentence, then he must have known something important about what really happened after that photograph was taken. Adrian's gaze lifted slowly toward the tall windows where the snow continued falling across the dark streets of Chicago. For years he had searched through records and old witnesses, trying to understand how his sister could vanish without leaving a single trace behind. Yet somehow the only real clue had been sitting inside a firefighter's locker the entire time. Adrian turned back to me with a look that was both serious and unexpectedly gentle. He asked one final question that made my heart beat a little faster even before I answered. When you found the photograph in your father's helmet, was there anything else in that locker that did not belong to him? Anything at all that might connect to the girl in this picture? I hesitated for a moment because there was one detail I had almost ignored that afternoon in the garage. At the time it seemed like nothing more than a small piece of jewelry mixed in with the rest of his old equipment. But standing there in Adrian Kane's mansion, I suddenly realized it might be the most important thing I had found. For a moment I considered telling him that there was nothing else in the locker, because that would have been easier than reopening the memory that suddenly returned to me. But Adrian Kane was watching me carefully now, and the seriousness in his expression made it impossible to pretend that detail did not exist. I took a slow breath and told him there had been one more thing. It was small enough that I almost overlooked it while cleaning out the garage. My father kept his old equipment inside a metal locker that smelled like dust, winter air, and the faint scent of smoke that never completely fades from a firefighter's gear. When I removed his helmet and the heavy coat folded beside it, something slid quietly across the bottom of the locker and stopped near my shoe. At the time I thought it was just a loose button or a piece of metal from one of his tools. But when I bent down to pick it up, I realized it was a necklace. Adrian's eyes sharpened the moment I said that word. I explained that the necklace was delicate, not something that looked like it belonged to my father at all. It was made of thin silver with a small pendant shaped like a snowflake. The design was simple but beautiful, the kind of piece a young girl might wear during the winter months. I remember turning it over in my hand that afternoon in the garage and wondering why it had been hidden inside the locker with his gear. At first I assumed it belonged to someone he had helped during a rescue and simply forgotten to return. My father had a habit of keeping small reminders from his work, things that represented the people he had met over the years. But the longer I looked at the necklace, the more it felt different from those other objects. It had been carefully wrapped in a thin cloth and tucked beneath the lining of the locker like something that mattered more than a random keepsake. Adrian did not interrupt while I spoke. His attention was so focused that it almost felt like the rest of the mansion had disappeared. I continued explaining that after I found the necklace, I placed it back inside the locker because I did not know what to do with it. The only thing I kept with me was the photograph and the note with Adrian's name. When I finished describing the necklace, Adrian slowly turned the photograph toward the light again. His voice was quieter now, but filled with certainty. He asked me if the snowflake pendant had a tiny mark carved into the back, something so small most people would not notice unless they looked closely. I tried to picture the necklace again in my mind, remembering the way the silver caught the light in the dim garage. Then the memory clicked into place. I told him yes. There was a small letter engraved on the back of the pendant. The letter I. Adrian Kane did not move for several seconds after hearing that. His fingers tightened around the photograph as if the truth had suddenly become too heavy to hold casually. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a quiet emotion that no one in that room would have expected from him. He told me that necklace was a gift he gave his sister Isabella the week before the fire. She wore it every day that winter. And according to every report written afterward, the necklace disappeared the same night she did. Adrian lifted his eyes to meet mine again, and in that moment the meaning of my father's message became impossible to ignore. If the necklace had been inside my father's locker all these years, then the story of that winter night had never been as simple as the city believed. I could see the moment the truth began rearranging itself inside Adrian Kane's mind. The necklace was no longer a forgotten object inside an old firefighter's locker. It was evidence that the official story from 15 winters ago had never been complete. The snowflake pendant, the photograph, the note written in my father's careful handwriting. Each piece suddenly felt like part of a message that had waited years to be understood. Adrian stood very still beside the tall window, the photograph held low in his hand while snow continued drifting quietly over the Chicago skyline outside. For a man who controlled entire rooms with a single glance, he now looked like someone carefully rebuilding a memory from fragments that never quite fit together before. When he finally spoke again, his voice was calm, but there was a new certainty in it. He told me that if the necklace had ended up in my father's locker, then Daniel Carter must have been the last person who saw Isabella that night. The thought seemed to settle heavily between us. I remembered my father's steady voice, the way he always said that firefighters never walked away from someone who still needed help. If Isabella had been frightened or alone after the crowd started leaving, my father would have stayed with her. That was the kind of man he was. Adrian turned the photograph once more toward the light and studied the image of the young girl standing beside Engine 14. The reflection in the glass of the frame showed her smiling in the cold winter air while the fire truck lights glowed faintly behind her. Adrian said something quietly then, almost like he was speaking to the past instead of to me. He said Isabella always loved the first snow of the year. She believed winter meant the world could start fresh again. I felt a strange warmth hearing that, because it sounded exactly like the kind of hopeful thing my father used to say as well. Adrian then asked me another question, one that made my heart beat faster because I knew the answer might change everything. He asked where the necklace was now. I told him the truth. It was still in my father's garage inside the metal locker. I had not moved it since the day I found it. Adrian nodded slowly, as if confirming something important to himself. The certainty in his expression grew stronger with every second. If the necklace had been hidden there for 15 years, then my father must have kept it safe for a reason. And if he left a message asking me to deliver the photograph, then tonight was not just coincidence. It was the moment he had prepared for long ago. Adrian finally looked at me in a way that felt less like a powerful man studying a stranger and more like someone recognizing the beginning of a long-buried truth. He said the necklace needed to be seen again because it might be the only object that could prove what really happened after the fire trucks left that street. Then he said something that surprised me even more. He told me that if Isabella Kane truly survived that night, then somewhere in this city there might be a woman who never knew the family still searching for her. Adrian's voice grew softer as he finished that thought. 15 years is a long time for a secret to stay hidden. But sometimes the smallest objects remember the stories people try to forget. And tonight a photograph and a snowflake necklace had just reopened a story the city believed was already finished. I stood there listening to the quiet certainty in Adrian Kane's voice and realized that the night had changed direction in a way neither of us expected when I first walked through those iron gates. What began as a simple delivery of a forgotten photograph had slowly turned into the reopening of a story buried under 15 years of silence. The mansion around us still glowed with warm Christmas lights, and the music drifting through the hall sounded peaceful, yet everything between us felt different now. Adrian no longer looked like a man remembering the past. He looked like someone preparing to face it. He studied the photograph one last time before carefully sliding it back into the envelope I had given him earlier. His movements were slow and deliberate, almost respectful, as if the thin piece of paper carried more weight than any document he had ever signed. When he finished, he turned toward me with a calm focus that made it clear he had already made a decision. He told me that tomorrow morning we would go to my father's garage together. He wanted to see the necklace with his own eyes. The snowflake pendant was no longer just a memory from a locker. It was a clue that connected the last confirmed moment of Isabella Kane's life to the only man who had stood beside her that night. My father. Hearing Adrian say that name with such respect stirred something unexpected inside me. For years Daniel Carter had simply been my father, the quiet firefighter who fixed broken cabinets and reminded me to lock the door before bed. Now I was beginning to see the larger story he had quietly carried without ever explaining it. Adrian's voice softened slightly as he spoke again. He said my father must have known the truth about that winter night, but chose to protect it until the right moment. The photograph, the necklace, and the note had all been left behind like pieces of a message waiting for someone to follow them. I looked toward the tall windows where the snow continued falling over the city. Somewhere beyond those streets was the place where my father had stood 15 years ago holding a camera and telling a frightened little girl that the world sometimes gives people a second chance. Adrian followed my gaze and spoke one final thought that lingered in the quiet air between us. If Isabella truly survived that night, then the life she built afterward might exist somewhere in this city without ever knowing the family who never stopped searching for her. The possibility hung there like the falling snow outside. Adrian then extended his hand toward me, not as a command, but as an invitation to the next step in a story neither of us had expected to share. Tomorrow we would open my father's old locker together. And for the first time in 15 years, Adrian Kane believed the truth about the girl who smiled in the snow might finally be waiting inside.